Welcome to this edition of Diligence Inside America's Boardrooms. I'm TK Kerstetter, and I'll be your host for today's show. Today, we're going to be talking about keys to composing an effective corporate board. And I'm really pleased to have my guest joining me on this topic, and that's Seth Goldman, who's the chairman of the board of Beyond Meat. He is the co-founder and CEO of Eat the Change, and is also the co-founder of Planet Burger. Seth, welcome.
Thank you, TK. Good to be with you.
I'm going to guess that you eat a lot of burgers, even though they're plants.
That's right.
So we want to talk about boards a little bit, and particularly composing. And often when a company does an IPO and you take a private company public, you need to restructure and recompose the board just because of what it's made up of. And so I know that you've either had experience or observed, these kinds of transactions. And I was hoping that you could share some of your experiences and also the thought process that one goes through when they're building a public board to best serve, the company and its new shareholders.
Sure. Well, it is a healthy transition. I mean, a lot of companies will get a board that usually is composed of lead investors over different, fundraisers. And so certainly for Beyond Meat, the IPO was a useful moment to reconfigure the board. And in fact, it was a necessity because a lot of the private equity funds that had been on the people who were representing them were on our board, and their charter in several cases prohibited them from serving on public company boards. So that on its own was a catalyst to re-examine the board, but it also made us re-examine the skill sets we needed. Certainly people who were familiar with private company growth and private company governance have different experiences, and we needed people in the boardroom who were, as we became a public company, who had public company experience. And so, of course, the first thing you need is someone as an audit chair, someone who has signed an audit statement from a public company. And so, we knew that was a set of skills. We had people who had been CFOs of other companies, but that's just one example. And then you run that sort of same analysis across all types of other duties, and it becomes an important, really pivotal moment for a board and for a company.
So one of the things you mentioned, the audit committee, and one of the things that I often get on my soapbox for, and that makes sense when you're composing, is you got to make sure that you have the right people to chair committees. And, the comp committee has clearly got as confusing and complex as the audit committee always has been. And even same is true somewhat for the new duties that have been part of a nom-gov chair. But, additionally, and this is what people don't think of, you not only have to think about those committees at the time, but you got to think about your bench, meaning committees have become so important. Who do you have that, that could step into those positions when the time is necessary? Or even the thought that depending on what type of business you are, do you need more than the traditional three committees? Do you need a risk committee? Do you need an environmental committee? Something that is or safety committee? I'm sure, somebody like Boeing right now would be thinking about a safety committee, but that thought process that you go through, what are those conversations like when you're going through that?
Yeah, I'll just focus on the audit for a second because that transition was critical. So we had people who had been CFOs of private companies, food companies before. But then we said, okay, we're going to be entering as a public company. We need people who've been not just CFOs, but CFOs of public companies that have ideally have worked in the same space as us. And so we were incredibly fortunate. We reached out to Kathy Waller, who I had known from my previous experiences with Honest Tea at Coca-Cola. And she had been the CFO of Coca-Cola. So, there's a blue chip stock where, a CFO has really done the deep analysis of a large company. And of course, Beyond Meat at the time was, 80 million in sales, 87 million in sales. So much smaller company, but somebody with her level of experience and gravitas really could make a contribution. And then at the same time, while we were doing the search, we also came across Ned Siegel, who was the CFO of Twitter. Very different company, very different experiences. But even though Beyond Meat is a food company, we recognize that somebody with the experience of rapid growth and of technology, like Ned, was going to be someone also valuable to have on the audit committee. So we basically we had that CFO from a private company, combined her with a CFO of a public company, food company, and then a CFO of a technology, social media company. And we I think, came up with a dream team for audit. And then, the idea is, can we do that across all the other committees? That balance of private, public, people familiar with the business and less familiar with the business, people familiar with rapid growth. So you got to it's kind of like a patchwork. It's a quilt, and you want to bring as much different contributions and different perspectives as you can.
Well, as a chair, you must be a good recruiter, because to get people of that caliber.
Yeah, we didn't use a search firm on that either, by the way. That was all just through networking. And I'm proud of that as well, that we really managed to, bring in diversity of perspective, experience. And that was and of course the company counts a lot too, right? This was a company growing quickly that people wanted to be part of, and that helped.
Yeah. So when you look back, and you went through the experience, what was like easier than you thought it would be, or worried about in the front? And then what turned out to be really a challenge that you weren't quite prepared for?
Well, it's probably still early because Beyond Meat has only been public now for a little less than 2 years. But one of the takeaways had been that there was this constant pressure from the public markets to think on a quarterly basis. And we have always been very, very deliberate in communicating that this is a long-term build. And so, of course, we as a company, we pay attention to the quarterly results, but we don't try to manage to a number. That would be the wrong thing to do. And so, I'd always heard that the public company, the downside is the short-termism it encourages. You lose sight of the big goals. And I think as long as you communicate to investors and the investment community that we are focused on the long term, 5 years, 10 years, 15 years away, and they understand that perspective, then I think it's easier. I think the challenge is if you have misaligned understandings, if everybody in the investment community thinks you're supposed to be managing to a number, and everyone in management and the board is focused on what looks like 5 and 10 years from now, that gap is where you would have problems. And so that for me, the downsides I had heard about, we haven't felt in the same way.
Yeah, well, that's good. I know it was always frustrating for me to miss what was traditionally called a whisper number.
Yeah.
And to have your stock hit with no thought about the stepping stone, of what you did that quarter going forward. And
I had a really interesting discussion with a good friend of mine who's a senior manager in the company. And he, just after we got public, and he's like, we should have our monitor in the building. When people walk in, they see the stock price. And I said, absolutely not. I said, because they're going to come in some days feeling great for not something they haven't done, and they'll feel terrible for things, even though they've done good work. What they should, if we were to have a monitor, I'd rather be looking at what are the sales growth, what's the impact growth, what's the distribution growth, what's the growth in followers. But we didn't go with either one. But it would have been the wrong message to the company to say we're now focused. Now that we're public, we're focused only on our stock price.
Yeah. There was a time not too long ago where in compensation to reward people, you couldn't use any discretionary information. Okay. And when your explanation right there is a perfect example, fortunately, the institutional investors and the proxy advisors moved off that theory, and because it just destroys just what you're talking about. And now that ESG and all the other stuff is here, you couldn't survive without discretionary, ability as a board of directors. So
yeah, and especially when you talk about long-term, if you're a company looking for long-term growth, all of those indicators, there's very few indicators that capture your long-term growth. So we're focused on building our infrastructure to be able to, scale production. That doesn't show up in some arbitrary, number.
Yeah. So Seth, I mean, you seem like a very thoughtful guy, and everything I've read about you, says the same thing. So what advice would you give the boards of directors, not only those that, are converting, but those that are, do need to sort of recompose their board to make sure that their board is ready to handle all the issues that are coming down the pike in the future, which are very, very unique, these last couple of years?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. And it's funny. I really do look at that. Managing the board is a key accountability for either the CEO or chair of the board. It's like I said, it is a piece of art when you put it together the right way. So think about that balance. And of course, when I look back to when I joined the board of Beyond Meat, this was back in 2013. It was all tech and finance people. There wasn't anybody who'd been in a food company. And so, you've got to think about not just where you are. And of course, it was a good reason that was that way, because it had been so many, finance and sort of tech oriented investors had come in. But you got to think about the kind of long-term business you're looking to build. And so we really focused on making sure the board and the guidance was relevant for where we wanted to end up as a company. And the board was the way it was because of where how the business had grown, but we knew the direction of the business. If we look up at today, a majority of people now on the board have had experience in food. And I think that's how it should be for a food company. So think about, where you want to be as a business, where you want to be relevant. And I think that's the right way to structure the board and the strategy for growth with the board as well.
Well, great advice. And Seth, I appreciate you taking the time. I'll leave you with one thought. My wife's a vegetarian. And so you have to keep that plant-based food coming.
And it's coming.
And be creative, because guys like me need to be creative. So
yeah, we're always iterating. That's what's so exciting. We are just at the beginning of this real repositioning of the whole food system, and it's shifting much more toward plants. And so your wife and you will be happy with what's ahead.
Okay. Well, I appreciate that. And I appreciate you taking the time. Thanks for joining us.
Great to be with you.
And that will conclude this edition of Inside America's Boardrooms. We hope you enjoyed the show. We'll be back again next week when we take another look at a critical topic that'll help you be a better board member or committee member. So we'll see you then.